Addis was your typical Gen Z girl, fiercely independent, unafraid of pushing boundaries, and utterly convinced that the world owed her nothing but adventure and success. Growing up in the small town of Nkanu, she always felt out of place. While her peers adhered to traditional values and customs, Addis scoffed at the old ways, dismissing them as outdated superstitions designed to stifle freedom. At 21, she was the first in her family to leave the village for university in Enugu. The city was everything she had hoped for, fast-paced, vibrant, and thrilling. It offered her the freedom to explore life on her terms. Addis quickly adapted, embracing city culture with open arms. She attended wild parties, experimented with new experiences, and dabbled in practices she barely understood, from tarot readings to manifestation rituals she found online. One night, at a house party hosted by her roommate Amoka, Addis' curiosity got the better of her. In one corner of the room, a small group had gathered around an older man dressed in flowing white robes. He spoke with authority about spiritual awakenings and the power of reconnecting with ancient forces. Intrigued, Addis joined the circle, her skepticism giving way to fascination as the man described a ritual that could bring wealth, power, and influence. "You must invoke the ancient ones," he said, his eyes glowing with intensity. "They reward those who honor them with gifts beyond imagination." Addis dismissed it as theatrics but couldn't shake the allure of the man's words. Later that night, fueled by alcohol and the encouragement of her peers, she decided to try the ritual. After all, what harm could it do? She followed the man's instructions, which involved lighting candles, drawing strange symbols on the floor, and chanting incantations in a language she couldn't understand. At first, nothing happened. Feeling both embarrassed and disappointed, she laughed it off and went to bed, thinking no more of it. But things began to change in the following days. Addis started having vivid dreams of a giant snake with gleaming eyes that watched her from the shadows. The dreams grew increasingly disturbing, with the snake coiling around her, whispering unintelligible words, and leaving her waking up drenched in sweat. Then came the night she could never forget. Addis was alone in her apartment, scrolling through TikTok when the air around her seemed to shift. The room grew unbearably cold, and an oppressive silence filled the space. She felt a presence, something ancient and malevolent. Before she could react, the snake from her dreams materialized before her, its massive body shimmering in the dim light. Paralyzed by fear, she tried to scream, but no sound came out. The snake slithered closer, its eyes locking onto hers. It spoke, but not with words. Its voice was inside her head, a dark, guttural tone that echoed through her mind. "You called me," it said. "And now, I have come to claim what is mine." Addis' world spiraled into chaos as the snake wrapped around her. The next moments were a blur of terror, pain, and helplessness. When it was over, she lay on the floor, trembling and broken. The snake had vanished, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight that refused to leave. In the days that followed, Addis tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a hallucination or the result of too much stress. But the signs were undeniable. Her body bore strange marks, and she began to experience strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, whispers in the dark, and an unshakable sense of being watched. Addis' vibrant personality faded. She withdrew from her friends, stopped attending classes, and rarely left her apartment. The few times she tried to open up, people dismissed her as paranoid or unstable. Even Amoka, her closest friend, began to distance herself. But the worst was yet to come. One night, Addis woke up to find herself unable to move. The snake was back, its massive body looming over her. This time, it didn't just attack, it spoke of her offenses, her abandonment of her roots, her mockery of tradition, and her reckless invocation of forces she didn't understand. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," it hissed. "Your defiance will cost you everything." Adi's ordeal was far from over. Unbeknownst to her, the ritual she had performed had connected her to a spiritual realm that demanded restitution. The snake was not just a tormentor but a manifestation of something deeper, an ancient punishment for those who transgressed boundaries they didn't comprehend. And now, Adis was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Adis' days blurred into endless cycles of dread and torment. Sleep offered no refuge, as the snake invaded her dreams nightly, its cold, scaled body wrapping tighter around her mind. She avoided mirrors because she no longer recognized herself. Her once bright eyes were now hollow, surrounded by deep, dark circles. The faint marks on her body had spread, forming intricate, snake-like patterns that glowed faintly in the dark. But the worst part was the whispers. They started as faint murmurs in her head but grew louder each day. The voices were not just the snakes but others, countless others, accusing her of sins she didn't even know she had committed. You abandoned the old ways. You mocked what your ancestors revered. You danced with fire, and now it burns. Adis tried to fight back. She visited pastors, herbalists, and even self-proclaimed spiritual healers, hoping someone could break whatever curse had gripped her. But none of them could help. One pastor prayed fervently over her, only to recall mid-session, trembling and muttering, "This one has invoked something ancient. It is beyond me." Her family got wind of her struggles and begged her to return home, but Adis couldn't bear the thought of her parents seeing her like this. The shame, the guilt, it was suffocating. Even if she returned, she wasn't sure what help they could offer. The spirits didn't care about her tears, and neither, it seemed, did the world around her. One fateful evening, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Adis reached her breaking point. The snake appeared again, but this time, it brought something worse, visions. She was no longer in her apartment but standing in a vast, desolate forest. The air was thick with an eerie mist, and the ground beneath her feet was alive, shifting and squirming like a mass of snakes. Figures emerged from the fog, women, their faces pale and eyes hollow. They were draped in tattered garments, their bodies marked with the same glowing patterns as Adis. They surrounded her, their mouths moving in unison as they chanted in a language she didn't understand. "Who are you?" Adis cried, her voice breaking. One of the women stepped forward, her face eerily familiar. It took Adis a moment to realize why. It was a reflection of herself, but older, worn, and lifeless. "We are what you will become," the woman said, her voice a haunting echo. "Bound to the spirit you awakened. It feeds on our defiance, our pride, and our ignorance." Adis shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know. I didn't mean for this to happen." The woman tilted her head, pity flashing in her lifeless eyes. "It doesn't matter. Intent means nothing to the ancient ones. You opened the door, and now it cannot be closed." Suddenly, the snake reappeared, larger and more menacing than ever. It coiled around Adis, dragging her deeper into the mist. The chanting grew louder, drowning out her screams. When she woke up, she was back in her apartment, her body trembling and drenched in sweat. But something was different. The marks on her skin had begun to pulse, emitting a faint, rhythmic glow. And the whispers in her head were no longer just voices, they were commands. "Go to the river. Submit. Fulfill your role." Adis tried to resist, but her body betrayed her. She found herself drawn to the riverbank near her village, a place she hadn't visited since childhood. The journey was a blur, her movements no longer her own. By the time she reached the water's edge, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving her bathed in moonlight. The river was eerily still, its surface like glass. Adis knelt at the edge, unable to fight the invisible force compelling her. As she stared into the water, the snake's reflection appeared, its eyes glowing like embers. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice a hiss that sent chills down her spine. Addis wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body was no longer hers. The snake began to rise from the water, its massive form towering over her. The chanting returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. The last thing Addis remembered was the snake lunging toward her, its jaws wide open. Then, darkness. When she awoke, she was back in her apartment, but everything felt different. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. The marks on her skin no longer glowed, but they remained, like scars etched into her flesh. Addis thought she might finally be free, but deep down, she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The snake had claimed her, and its presence, though dormant for now, lingered just beneath the surface. Something had shifted inside her, something she couldn't explain, let alone control. And as the days turned into weeks, Addis began to notice the changes, the way people avoided her gaze, the way animals recoiled from her presence, and the way her reflection in the mirror seemed to smirk when she wasn't looking. Addis had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the spirit snake was far from done with her. Addis' life became a silent horror she could no longer share with anyone. Though the snake no longer physically appeared, she felt its presence constantly, coiled deep within her, watching, waiting. The glow of her skin's strange patterns faded, but her body felt like it no longer belonged to her. The changes became more obvious as time passed. Her appetite diminished, replaced by a gnawing hunger she couldn't satisfy. Animals, especially cats and dogs, hissed and barked at her as though they could sense something sinister. Friends and neighbors whispered about her when they thought she wasn't listening. "She's cursed," one said. "She brought something into herself," another muttered. Addis stopped attending church, despite her mother's pleas. Whenever she stepped near a place of worship, a sharp, searing pain shot through her body, and she would feel an overwhelming need to flee. Her world grew smaller, her existence darker. One night, unable to bear the isolation, she called her mother and told her everything. The words spilled out between sobs, the ritual, the snake, the marks, the visions. Her mother's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, she spoke. "You must return home, Addis. There are things older than us, things we don't understand. You've touched one of them. Only the elders can help you now." Addis didn't believe in the old ways, but she had no other options. The torment was relentless, and she knew she was losing herself. The next morning, she boarded a bus back to Nkanu, hoping that returning to her roots might offer her some kind of salvation. When she arrived, her mother was waiting with a group of elders, men and women who carried the weight of centuries of tradition. They didn't waste time asking questions. Instead, they led her to the shrine at the edge of the village, a place Addis hadn't seen since childhood. The shrine was ancient, overgrown with vines and surrounded by towering trees. At its center was a large stone carved with the image of a snake. Addis shivered as she recognized the same coiled form that haunted her dreams. The chief priest, an old man with piercing eyes, stepped forward. He carried a staff adorned with cowrie shells and feathers. "You have summoned the great spirit of the river," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "You have broken the boundary between the living and the spirits, and now it demands payment." Addis fell to her knees. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to, please, help me." The priest shook his head solemnly. "Ignorance is no excuse. The spirit has claimed you. It will not let go easily." The elders began the ritual. They circled Addis, chanting in a language older than memory. The air grew thick with incense smoke, and the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. Addis felt the snake stir within her, resisting the pull of the elders' prayers. Suddenly, a piercing shriek tore through the air. Addis screamed as the glowing marks on her skin reignited, burning as though they were being carved anew. Her body convulsed, and the snake's voice roared in her mind. You cannot take what is mine. The elders' chants grew louder, their voices drowning out the snake's defiance. Adi's body arched, her eyes rolling back as she felt the snake being pulled from her. The pain was indescribable, as though her very soul was being torn apart. Finally, with a deafening hiss, the snake erupted from her body in a blinding flash of light. It writhed and thrashed before the shrine, its massive form shrinking until it was no more than a shadow. The priest struck the ground with his staff, and the shadow dissolved into the earth. Adis collapsed, her body trembling and drenched in sweat. The glowing marks were gone, leaving only faint scars. The oppressive weight she had carried for months was lifted, but she felt hollow, like a part of her had been taken with the spirit. The priest knelt beside her, his face weary but kind. You are free, child, but you will never be the same. The spirits do not forget. You must live carefully, honor the old ways, and never again call upon forces you do not understand. Adis nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. She stayed in the village for months, slowly rebuilding her life under the watchful guidance of her family and the elders. But even as the seasons changed and the pain of her ordeal faded, Adis knew she would carry the scars, both visible and invisible, for the rest of her life. The snake was gone, but its shadow lingered in her memories, a constant reminder of the price of defiance and the power of things too ancient to be trifled with. Thank you for watching. Please do well to like, comment, and share. Thank you.